All right, let's have some more fun with Flexbox. What about the typical grid layout? Okay, well, we might have a wrapper called grid, and then very much like if you've used Bootstrap, you might have something like a grid row, and then each row would consist of your various columns. So for example, grid column, and within here we'll just do 1, and why don't we do 4 columns here? All right, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, let's switch to our CSS, and what would be the first step? Well, if you think about it, each grid row should have a flexible layout. So I could say grid row display is flex. So now, right off the bat, we don't have to do any floats or any weirdness like that, thank God. However, we still have this issue. For example, if I set a background color of gray to the grid, well, yeah, we have all of this space, but all of these guys are jumped up on the left edge. And that's because, well, they're only taking up as much space as they require. And in this case, it's a single character, so that's as wide as it needs to be, and nothing more. But now, what if we wanted to say to each of these, well, we want you to use the space. Just think of it like that, use the space. Well, I could say grid column and be flexible. Done. And why don't we go ahead and align the text to the center and get rid of our gray backgrounds. Okay, so now, remember, flex 1 is the key here. Anything else is just visual stuff. So why don't we set a border all around of 1 pixel solid gray. And there you go. We didn't have to use floats. We didn't have to set predefined widths. And in fact, this is very flexible. So let's create another one, and this will be essentially 50% per column. Done. And by the way, let's set some margin bottom just for the demo. Okay, so that one's done. Why don't we do another one? How about this time we have 8? So 4, 6, and 8. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Done. See how easy this is? I'm not joking. Flexbox is the best thing to happen to CSS in a very long time. What if we want to nest things? So let's do another round. So we'll say this second one will have its own set. So I'll take that and paste it in here. And there we go. It works. Now in this case, do note that because we were applying margin bottom for the demo, that's where this extra space is coming from. So if I were to remove that, you'll see it take up the proper amount here. But remember, they will automatically adjust. So for example, if this first one has a bunch of lorem ipsum text, you'll see that the box on this side adjusts accordingly. But anyways, why don't I bring back some margin bottom just for an example. Okay, let's get rid of that to keep things kind of clean. And we'll do one more. What about the typical thing where you have like a sidebar and a main content? Okay, well, let's give these a couple class names to hook into them. We'll call this sidebar and main. And now I will say, well, the sidebar should have a flex basis of 150 pixels. And then the primary section will have a flex basis of, 500 pixels. It doesn't matter. We do have some flexibility here. So writing this doesn't mean that primary is now 500 pixels wide. In this case, you can see it's not. It will still be flexible, but it's sort of like in a perfect scenario, if it can, try to get as close to that as possible. Now notice if we scroll down, as I get smaller, yeah, that keeps going lower and lower. However, watch what happens if we say flex wrap equals wrap. Well, now they get pushed down, and that's because we have set of flex spaces. So we're saying, yeah, ideally, I want the primary section to be 500 pixels. So, well, by default, if we're not wrapping, it has to modify. It has to be flexible to fit the space. But in this case, we're saying, no, you can wrap onto the next line if you need to. So if we pull this out, yeah, now this is a minimum of 150 pixels, and this is a minimum of 500. And as we scroll down, notice if we get to a point where we don't meet that minimum, so for example, this should be almost exactly 150. Yeah, you can see. So if I bring it down further, it can no longer fit that space using the flex spaces here, so they will wrap onto the next line. And then at that point, the flexible nature kicks in again. So sidebar, yeah, we have a flex spaces of 150 pixels, but it's flexible to fill up the space, so it does. And yeah, I know that's a little confusing, but just play around, buckle down, and once you figure this stuff out, you'll know it for your whole career. All right, so let's switch over to something else. How about what about that holy grail layout that we see all the time? So for example, we have a main wrapper, and then we would have a header section, my site, and then we might have a sidebar, and then we would have like a main content area, main content, and then finally a footer section. All right, so how can we set it up so that the header takes up all the space, the sidebar is off to the left, the main content's off to the right, and the footer is at the bottom taking up 100% of the width, right? Your typical bread and butter layout. Okay, it's actually very, very easy. Let's start by just setting some background colors to make this really easy to see. So for example, a side will have background of yellow, main will have a background of blue, and then footer will have a background of pink, just so we can see the boundaries a bit more. Okay, next, and by the way, why don't we switch to SAS? Okay, then I'll say H1, no margin, to push that up. Okay, so this is just our setup. It has nothing to do with anything. Now will be our Flexbox specific stuff, the only stuff that actually matters. Okay, so yeah, we want a flexible layout, right? So let's say container, display, flex. And yeah, it's going to do that thing where because the default flex direction is row, it tries to display each child item in a row. Okay, makes sense. But now, yeah, we want the header to take up the full space, 100%. So I could say header, and let's try this. We're going to set flex basis to 100%. So yeah, like we said before, we're trying to be as close as possible to 100% of the width, but we're flexible. Think of it like a car salesman. This is the amount they want for the car, but they're flexible on it. Same basic idea. Now in this case, it did increase in width. So if I turn that off, yeah, that's how it is normally. And if I set flex spaces to 100%, it does increase, but why does it stop right here? It's important to figure this out. And the reason is it's growing as much as it can, but not too much where these guys can't fit in. So for example, notice that the entire width of that word is the width of the box. So the header physically can't grow any wider than this. However, what if we do that trick where we say flex wrap is wrap? Well, now we're saying, yeah, you can wrap onto a new line if you need to, and if you want to better honor the flex spaces. Flex spaces works really well with flex wrap. So now we're saying, yeah, I want to be 100% of the width. And if you need to wrap onto a new line in order to make that possible, then that's what you need to do. That's how that works. Okay, so we want to do the same for the header and the footer, right? So now let's say the sidebar, we're going to give that a flex spaces of 175 pixels. Okay, so if we measure that once again, right around 175 pixels. But now, why isn't the main content section stretching or being flexible to fill up the remaining space? And that's because we haven't told it to be flexible. So once again, it takes up as much width as it needs to. And that equates to the width of these characters right here and nothing more. So if we want to tell main content to use the space once again, then we can just say main, explore the space, and that will stretch out. Now here's another cool thing about Flexbox. If you ever want to have that thing where the background of your sidebar is equal to the background of your main content, if you were using floats, you know that ends up being really weird. Once again, weirdly difficult to accomplish. And we would end up doing a thing where you use like CSS display table in order to make that work, but then that kind of feels wrong too, right? Well, with Flexbox, it's completely a non-issue. So for example, maybe here we have 10 list items, each that has an anchor tag that says some link. Okay, yeah, notice how the main content background just extends however much it needs to so that we have a nice, even layout. Okay, but let's take this even further. What about when we get to a certain breakpoint for mobile devices? Well, we don't want to do this anymore. We do want to split everything onto its own line. Maybe the sidebar is 100%, the main content is 100%, all of that stuff. Okay, well, I could just say media screen, and our measurement here will be, well, if the max width does not exceed 480 pixels, well, in that case, I want everything to have a flex spaces of 100%. So I could say container, all root children, and I'm sorry, I'm pretty low here, aren't I? Let's bring that up. Okay, now they will all have a flex spaces of 100%. And remember, that works because of flex wrap. So if I didn't have this, take a look. Yeah, it'll bump up and it's just going to display horizontally. Flex spaces is 100%, but we're flexible on that number. So they all adjust accordingly to fill up the space. And remember, actually on that note, if we came up and set flex direction to something that's not a row, for example, column, and we fill that out, notice how this works. And then further, if we set flex spaces And it's important to note, flex spaces doesn't just refer to width. It refers to, well, the width, but along the main axis. So in this case, we change the main axis from top to bottom. So that means flex spaces will be along that y-axis. So if I change that to 200 pixels, you'll see the length increase, not the width. And if we measure this, this will be like 200 pixels, as you can see. That's how that works. Again, very tricky, but once you figure this out, it'll never be a problem again. All right, so let's bring this back to like we had before. And we can't forget to say flex wrap is wrap. Okay, so take a look. We have a responsive layout, and it didn't require much work at all. So hide the HTML. There's our normal layout, but as we go to a certain breakpoint that you define, we switch over to 100% width. Okay, let's move on to another one. Well, what about, let me show you this option here. Once again, we're going to have a little navigation area. And just so you don't have to watch, I'll paste this in. Okay, so yeah, we have an unordered list with a few links, and then one list item that contains a search form. Okay, let's play around with this. Let's do some initial setup. So I'll set font family to sans serif. Then we'll do a little reset for the list itself. But then, well, you know what? For the list item, we'll set margin on the top and bottom and nothing on the left and right. And then finally, for the anchor tag, we'll set a color of black, text decoration of none. But when we hover over it, we will add the underline. And finally, why don't we set a display of inline block here. Okay, so yeah, that should do the trick for initial setup. Now we can focus on things that actually matter. If we want to display this in a line, and we learned a little bit about this in the last episode, then we can just say display flex. This should almost be second nature to you at this point. And let's remove those bullets, by the way. Next, why don't we set a background color of like black, and then set this color to white. Okay, so once again, everything's nestled up against the left edge because each item is taking up as little space as is required to contain it. So now we want to say to each of these list items, explore the space. So I can say nav list item, explore the space, and now they will stretch. But now consider this. Imagine that somewhere within your list you have something that adjusts the height. This could be an icon or some other container. In this case, I'll represent that with a lot of padding on the anchor tag. But now we don't have padding on the list item. So we fall into this trap where, okay, well, the input now no longer is showing up aligned here, right? And what do you end up doing in those cases? It gets a little tricky. In this case, not tricky at all. Align all of your items to the center. Done. But next, well, what if we play around with that justify content property that we learned? So for example, if we set it to center, yeah, it doesn't seem like anything is changing. Flex start, flex end. You might have learned about space around or space between. Nothing changes. And that's because they're already flexible, so they're already taking up as much space as to fill the container. So watch what happens if I were to comment that out. Well, now if I change this around, for example, center, it will take effect. And that's because we aren't taking up the whole available space. So on that condition, what should we do? In this case, we could say center, flex start, go to the left, flex end, go to the right, again, as per the direction. But anyways, if we change this to space between, this is going to make sure that the width between each one is the same amount. So there you go. But we could also do space around, and now we can see that everything is aligned with the same amount of space around them. But now here's one of the coolest things. We can once again be very, very responsive. So what if at a certain breakpoint we want them to take up the full width? Well, once again, this should be second nature now. Screen, if the max width is 480 pixels, well, what do we do? In that case, do we say width is 100%? Is that what we do? That's kind of the traditional thing. Well, no, that's not what we want. In this case, well, think about it. Using Flexbox, what would we change to just say we want each of these to go vertically rather than horizontally? And we've already learned about this. We can just say flex direction. Flex direction is now column. There you go. So above 480, and notice up here as we hit the breakpoint. So if we come down, there's 480, and now we have a perfectly mobile optimized navigation bar. So yeah, I think that'll do it for part 2 of our review of Flexbox. There's no reason for you not to be using it at this point, so buckle down, figure it out, and you'll have it in your tool belt for your entire career.